Joining me now, Congresswoman Sara Jacobs, Democrat of California. She is the House Democratic Caucus Leadership Representative. Congresswoman Jacobs, first of all, thank you for joining us. And before we get into the legacy of Roe versus Wade, I want to get your take on the news that White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain is stepping down. Klain celebrated his second anniversary just yesterday in a position where the average tenure is about 18 months. What's your reaction?
Look, I think Ron is going to be very missed in that position, although he is allowed his much-deserved rest. I think by virtue of all the things we've been able to accomplish in these 2 years, it's very clear he has been one of the most successful White House Chief of Staffs ever. I actually worked with him before I was in Congress and before he was White House Chief of Staff, and I know what a thoughtful and amazing person he is, and he has been such an asset to the Biden administration.
Yes, I can say honestly, in my capacity as head of National Action Network, he was always accessible and has always been a straight shooter. But let me move on. Yesterday, the president marked the halfway point of his first term, promoting his administration's successes over this past 2 years. That 2-year span marks your own tenure in Congress, in which you've become the youngest member of the House Democratic leadership. As caucus now finds itself in the minority, given all that, this divided Congress he must navigate to get things passed, where do you hope the president throws his weight between now and 2024?
By any measure, what President Biden has already accomplished in his first term has been historic. We passed the biggest investment in climate change ever. We passed the first gun violence prevention legislation since I was in elementary school. We passed a bipartisan infrastructure bill that presidents from both parties have been talking about for decades and never been able to get done. We've created 11 million jobs. We pulled millions of children out of poverty. Even if nothing gets done over the next few years, which I don't think will happen, it has already been a historic term, and we've been able to do that with the slimmest of majorities in the Congress. So now, as we go into the minority, I still think there will be a lot of room to be able to get things done and deliver for the American people. I'll be focusing on trying to address the high cost of living for families, especially around housing and childcare, which for my constituents in San Diego are huge, huge burdens and barriers. And I think that there'll be some room to do bipartisan compromise on those issues.
Now, the Biden White House has maintained its stance that it will not negotiate with House Republicans over our national debt ceiling, which the U.S. hit Thursday. Republicans want spending cuts from the administration in exchange for raising the limit. Failure to raise the limit by June may result in the country defaulting on its debt for the first time in history, possibly leading to market turmoil and complicating the government's ability to make Social Security payments. Some economists warn recession could ensue. Of course, this is not the first time you've had a standoff over the debt ceiling, but now you have the expanded influence of the right wing of this House, GOP, driving the deadlock. What's going to happen?
Look, I think it's very simple. Democrats want to protect Social Security and Medicare, and the extreme Republicans want to hold the full faith and credit of the United States hostage to be able to cut Medicare and Social Security. And so I agree with President Biden. We are not going to negotiate with hostage takers. Frankly, I think it doesn't make sense to have us vote on the debt ceiling at all. We've already voted to appropriate this funding. We should allow the executive branch to spend the money to execute on what we've already authorized and appropriated and voted on in Congress. So I actually support getting rid of a debt limit. We're only one of 2 countries that has one. But in the meantime, I think it's important that we continue standing up for Medicare, for Social Security, for all of the things that we know Americans want and need from their government, and that Congress has already voted to approve.
Congresswoman, as we discuss priorities, you sit on the Congressional Pro-Choice Caucus. Opponents of reproductive rights were out in force for yesterday's March for Life in Washington, and many in the House GOP are supporting a national ban on abortion 7 months after the overturning of Roe after 50 years. I read this week about your plans to reintroduce reproductive rights legislation that stalled in the House last year, specifically your bill to limit the collection of reproductive health data on websites and phone apps. What's your strategy in getting this bipartisan support on this particular issue in this Congress?
Look, I think the fact that the March for Life ended at Congress shows very clearly that this was never about state rights. We know the extreme Republicans want a national abortion ban. They've already introduced it. And it's clear that the majority of Americans don't want that. And they showed that very clearly in this midterm election. So we're going to keep standing up for abortion access, for abortion rights. And we're going to make sure while we're doing that, we're working to protect people in states that are already criminalizing abortion. And one of the ways we really need to do that is to protect reproductive and sexual health data in the way that my bill would do. Now, there was a poll done in October that showed that the majority of Americans, including the majority of Republicans, want Congress to act to protect reproductive and sexual health data from being sold or shared without your consent. And so there is bipartisan consensus among the American people. And I am working now with privacy-minded Republicans to try and see if there is a version of this bill we can craft that will be able to pass in a bipartisan way.
Lastly, Congresswoman, as of this week, we now have some GOP House members that have denied the 2020 election results and expressed sympathies with the January 6th insurrectionists sitting on committees tasked with defending our institutions and investigating threats to them. Marjorie Taylor Greene, Paul Gosar, Lauren Boebert, and Scott Perry now all sit on the House Oversight Committee. Greene is also on the Homeland Security Committee. You're on House Democrat Steering and Policy Committee, which makes those committee assignments for the other side of the aisle. What's your takeaway on all this?
Look, I think that these committee assignments show very clearly that Kevin McCarthy mortgaged his speakership and the Republican majority to the far right, that he will be the weakest speaker in history, and that he's already given up all the power to the extreme parts of his party. I think it's a really sad day for America when someone who defrauded small businesses sits on the Small Business Committee, when someone who's being investigated by the Justice Department is going to be sitting on the committee investigating those investigations, when someone who doesn't believe in the safety and security of our country sits on the Homeland Security Committee. So I think this was a moment where Republicans could have shown leadership and could have actually shown the American people that they were willing to fight for what they said they were going to do in the election and address inflation. And instead, they're so focused on kowtowing to the far right extreme and fighting with each other than doing the right thing for the American people.
All right. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for being with us, Congresswoman Sara Jacobs.